Hello there, my name is Benjamin Firth, and you guessed it, today we will be going over the Redux cycle. Okay, so the first step in the Redux cycle is to make an action creator. So, an action creator is a function that takes in what we call a payload, or just general information that you want to use. This information is then used to return an action object. This object, nothing unusually special about it, but what it does contain is two key values, which would be that payload that we put in, and also a type. In this example, we're going to take an action creator called add movies. We're going to pass in our payload of movies, which in this might be, let's say, an array of objects. Each object is an individual movie. As you see here, there's going to be a type, and then this is where we're going to say add movies as the type name. It's general convention here to capitalize all letters and use underscores as spaces. And then after that, the next key value pair will be the key of movies, and that's where we pass in that movies payload. So after we've created our action creator that then returns an action object, our next step is to dispatch this action object to use in a later function. So a dispatch is a built-in function from Redux that takes in the action object. An example of this would be in this function below. Here we have dispatch, and we're actually passing in the action creator with this payload getting passed in. So this action creator here will return an action object, which is then passed into this dispatch function. After we've created our dispatch, the next step is then to create a reducer. A reducer is a pure function that takes in the previous state and an action, and then returns the next state. In simplest terms, a pure function is a function that accepts an input and returns a value without modifying any data outside its scope. Some key things to remember about reducers is that there should be one reducer for each key and state. Another term for this would also be the Redux store. Additionally, each reducer fires on load, and when one reducer fires, all of your reducers will fire as well. And that's why we have to set up conditional statements like the ones you're about to see in this example below. So in this example, we're going to have our movies reducer function. Again, it takes in that previous or default value for state, which in this case we're assigning to an empty array, as well as taking in an action. So we make this switch case statement here to decide based on that action type property whether this particular reducer will be the one that is changed, because remember they fire all at the same time. So we're firing our switch based on the action type. In this case, we have our original action type of add movies, so that's the case. And if this is matched, then we will return action movies. We also make a default statement here So if perhaps a different reducer is the one we intended on firing, so the action type doesn't match, we will just return state. After we create our reducer, and in that previous example it would be specifically our movie reducer, we are going to create our root reducer, which is the reducer that combines all of our reducers to be pushed up into our Redux store. This is done using combine reducers, which is a built-in method from Redux. Here's kind of where you assign the key name you want the store to actually have later, and you give it the value of its corresponding reducer. So this takes in each reducer as a value for each key in this store or state. And you can assign a variable of root reducer to combine reducers. An example of this is here. So we have this root reducer variable that we've defined as the result of combine reducers, which again is an inherited method from Redux. And we're passing in our movies reducer as the value for a movies key. So after we've combined our reducers into our root reducer, it's finally time to create our Redux store. So this is actually done with a built-in method on Redux called createStore. This takes in the root reducer, and for our case it will also take in dev tools that we can use to analyze this. So in this example, we're creating a variable called store. And remember this because it's going to be useful in the next step. But this variable is then assigned to that built-in method from Redux, createStore. And here we're passing in the root reducer, and then I abbreviated, but we're also passing in compose with DevTools. So this next step is actually a continuation of the last one. This is where we use that store variable that we just created. Now we're going to involve what's called a provider, which is essentially a component inherited from React Redux. It makes the Redux store available to any nested components that have been wrapped in this connect function that we're about to get to later. So in this example, you see the provider being wrapped around our app component, and then we're passing in that variable of store that we declared earlier as a property on the provider assigned to the name of store. So after we're done creating our store and using the provider to wrap our app, we're then going to move to either mapping state to props or mapping dispatch to props. Both of these are functions that we create. Map state to props is where you get props from the Redux store, and map dispatch to props is where you would send or dispatch information to the store. In this case, for our example, because we are adding movies to our store, we're going to use match dispatch to props. So here you can see that we're creating a variable called map dispatch to props. This is where we're passing in dispatch, and then with that we are creating a key of add movies, which is the same as our action creator, but it doesn't actually have to be. It just helps. And then that key is assigned to a function where we're passing in movies, which is that movies data that we're trying to eventually get up to our Redux store. And then we're running that dispatch that we went over earlier, where we're passing in the actual add movies action creator with that movies data. This new property then of add movies could be used somewhere. Let's say if we're trying to fetch from an API of movies, we can use this add movies property to add these movies in that fetch. After creating our match dispatch to props function, we've arrived at our final step. This is where we will use that connect function that we talked about earlier with the provider. The connect function connects a React component to a Redux store. It accepts 4 different parameters. All of them are optional, and they are map state to props, which we talked about it, map dispatch to props, which we also talked about, as well as merge props and options, which aren't quite as common. So as you can see from our example here, we're taking this connect function. We're actually doing a placeholder of null right here, because usually that's where you would put map state to props. And then our second parameter that we are going to use for our example is map dispatch to props, because remember we're sending up those movies to our Redux store. And then this last bit is that we're connecting it up to our app, because that's where we're having this connect action happen. And that's all. So thanks for watching my guide on the Redux cycle. Again, my name is Benjamin Firth, and please click the button below to subscribe.